Hi, the focus of this lesson is Native Americans in the Yellowstone region, going back to the late Pleistocene at the end of the last period of major glaciation in North America, all the way through the pre-Columbian era before European settlers arrived in North America. And then the situation in Yellowstone and the Indian tribes in the vicinity of Yellowstone when peoples of European descent, settlers of European descent, pushed westward, resulting in conflicts with these people. So we'll talk about some of those conflicts, and then we'll finish this lesson with a discussion of early scientific exploration of Yellowstone, which ultimately contributed greatly to the establishment of Yellowstone as a national park. The Pleistocene geological epoch lasted from about 2.5 million years ago through the period of the last major glaciation of the North American continent about 12,000 years ago. And near the end of the Pleistocene, sea levels were much lower because of the widespread glaciation in the northern hemisphere, meaning that there was an entire region between what is currently Siberia, Russia, and Alaska, which was above sea level. And this was called Beringia, which is now the Bering Sea. But the current theory of the origination of peoples in North America, in the Americas, North America and South America, is that during this period in the late Pleistocene, you had one or more migrations of people from what is now Siberia across into Alaska, and then they rapidly peopled North America and South America over the course of a relatively short period of time, around 13 to 12,000 years ago. So one of the cultures that emerged in North America during this early period of the Holocene and late Pleistocene is called the Clovis culture. And it's thought that the Clovis culture is the direct ancestors of all, well, maybe not all, but most of the Native American cultures that were in the Americas in the pre-Columbian era, before Columbus came to the New World. So the Clovis culture is one of the things that's distinct about the Clovis culture is the manufacture of biface, meaning both sides, stone implements, mainly spear points that look a lot like this black obsidian point shown on this slide here, down here. So these stone implements were manufactured, and it actually required a great deal of skill through a process called knapping or flaking, where you would strike a stone along the edges to chip away little flakes of the stone and create an edge. Clovis points and later Folsom points, which was a culture that emerged out of Clovis, are characterized by what's called fluting here in the bottom, where a channel was cut out. And the thinking is that this fluting created a narrower base that allowed these points to be fitted to wooden shafts more easily. So Clovis points have been found throughout North America, and some of them have been found, not many, let's say a low number, single digits. I read a book recently that said only 2 Clovis points have been found in Yellowstone National Park. So what this tells us is that probably Clovis culture paleo-Indians did not live in Yellowstone, in the region of Yellowstone National Park year-round, but they did visit Yellowstone National Park. And the thinking is that maybe the reason was this, is that in the wake of the last period of major glaciation, there was tremendous amounts of meltwater inundating Yellowstone, so the climate and the environment there was not really very conducive to human habitation. It's not even very conducive to human habitation today because of the extreme weather in the winter months. But we know that these Clovis points have been found in Yellowstone, and Folsom points as well from the later Folsom culture, meaning that paleo-Indians did visit Yellowstone. And uh, later on, around 8,000 years ago, there was an Indian paleo-Indian culture that arose in the region of Yellowstone that's now called the Cody culture, because the original artifacts of this culture were discovered near Cody, Wyoming, which is just east of Yellowstone National Park. And so this is a Cody culture arrowhead. And this culture, the Clovis culture, was predominantly, these Paleo-Indians predominantly hunted mammoth and mastodon, large megafauna that existed in North America in the late Pleistocene and early Holocene. But by the time of the emergence of the Cody culture, these megafauna were, one theory is they were hunted to extinction. Nobody's sure 100% what caused the extinction of mammoths and mastodons in North America, but certainly hunting contributed. So the Cody culture were predominantly bison hunters, and the bison of the time was much larger than our modern day bison, but they hunted bison using spear and arrowheads that look like this. So another thing, we know that Paleo-Indians visited Yellowstone, and through the pre-Columbian era, Yellowstone was really important to many Native American cultures, and one of the reasons was that in Yellowstone there is a formation that, I'm trying to draw a square around it right here, that is called obsidian cliffs. So obsidian is a kind of volcanic glass. It forms when rhyolitic, so high silica content lava, cools very quickly, so quickly that there's not time for crystalline structure to form, and so what you get instead is a glass. Glass is an amorphous solid. It's a material that lends itself very readily to this manufacturing technique of knapping, creating very sharp edges. In fact, I've read that some surgeons, some surgeries still use obsidian implements, because obsidian can hold an edge that's sharper than you can get with steel. But obsidian cliffs in Yellowstone, one of the weird things about obsidian cliffs is that obsidian can be, the location from where the obsidian was harvested can be determined by analyzing the molecular structure of the obsidian. And obsidian from obsidian cliffs has been found throughout North America, which means that Paleo-Indians engaged in trade that for these high quality obsidian raw material for making arrowheads and spear points, these obsidian stone tools, stone implements that were manufactured from obsidian cliffs have been found as far away as Ohio. There's an Indian culture that emerged in Ohio called the Hopewell culture, which built these tremendous mounds, and these mounds are still visible today, are still there today. And obsidian from obsidian cliffs has been found in these mounds. That's over 2,000 miles away. There's also another material that's found in Yellowstone, which was important for these Paleo-Indian and pre-Columbian Native American tribes for manufacturing stone tools and stone points for implements. It's a material called chert, and there's a formation, an outcrop of chert in the northern region of Yellowstone National Park, called Crescent Hill chert, and chert from this formation has been found throughout the region as well. So in 1968, a 12,000, 13,000 year old skeleton of a 1 to 2 year old boy was found in Park County, Montana, which is just north of Yellowstone National Park. And so this burial site has come to be called the Anzac burial site. And it is important. It is extremely significant because it is the only Clovis culture burial site that has ever been found. And just north of Yellowstone in Park County, Montana. So it's amazing. It's the only Clovis culture burial site that has ever been found. And we know that this 1 to 2-year-old boy was buried in sort of a ceremonial fashion because he was buried with stone implements, stone tools, and antler tools made out of bone and antler. And these tools, this burial site was sprinkled with red ochre, a kind of reddish clay material. And so eventually the DNA from this skeleton was recovered and sequenced completely, giving a complete genome of Clovis culture individual in North America dating back almost 13,000 years ago. And what was discovered is that this DNA strongly supports the hypothesis that humans migrated to North America across the Bering Sea land bridge that emerged during the period of the late Pleistocene, at the end of the last period of major glaciation in North America, 14 to 12,000 years ago. And during this time, there was actually, people who inhabited this region called Beringia, where the Bering Sea is now, dating back as much as 20 to 25,000 years ago. So this Anzac site is tremendously significant, and basically is one of the strongest pieces of evidence for this hypothesis of how people got to the Americas across the Bering Sea land bridge. So this map is showing the rough distribution of major Native American cultural groups and language groups that existed in North America before individuals which of the new nation, the United States of America, started moving westward. So this is before Lewis and Clark, Corps of Discovery expedition, to explore the Louisiana Purchase and find a route to the Pacific Ocean, when Thomas Jefferson was president in the early 1800s. So Yellowstone on this map is somewhere in this region. So this is the Missouri River right here, which flows. The Lewis and Clark expedition spent a lot of time traveling on the Missouri River, and they were looking for a route to the Pacific Ocean. So they were traveling up the Missouri River, looking for the headwaters of the Missouri, hoping that they could then find an easy route. Travel was much easier on rivers than over land back in 1804 through 1806 when this expedition was happening. But they were looking for a route across the mountains to the Pacific Ocean. And they eventually found one with many adventures along the way, and having much interaction with many native tribes along the way. We now know that the Yellowstone region, in what is now Yellowstone National Park, was frequented by many different tribes of Native Americans, including the Crow, which were closely related to the Sioux Indians of the plains, the Shoshone, several tribes and subgroups of Shoshone Indians, including the Bannock and the Sheep Eaters, which it was the habit of Shoshone society to sort of name subgroups of Shoshone after one of their major food sources. So you can imagine what sheep eaters ate. And we know that the sheep eaters were actually year-round residents of Yellowstone National Park. Many tribes would frequent Yellowstone, predominantly in the summer months for hunting or for ceremonial reasons. But the sheep eaters lived there year-round. Other native tribes that frequented the region, the Nez Perce Indians, which are native to what is now eastern Washington and Oregon, and central Idaho, would journey to Yellowstone frequently. The Blackfeet, which are native to Montana and in Canada. A specific tribe of Blackfeet called the Piegans will figure into our story later on. So they'll come back into our story. But what we know is Yellowstone was a hunting ground. It was, with the exception of the sheep eaters, it doesn't look like many native people lived there year round. So it was sort of a neutral land where tribes could come to hunt before returning to their home territories, and it was perhaps a spiritual retreat for these native peoples. So the Lewis and Clark expedition, which was 1804 through 1806, left St. Louis and traveled up the Missouri. They were looking for the headwaters of the Missouri and had interactions with Shoshone, Nez Perce, Blackfeet Indians, Sioux Indians, and of course Indians of the Pacific Northwest as well when they eventually reached the Pacific via the Columbia River. And what's interesting is the Corps of Discovery, Lewis and Clark expedition, they traveled close to Yellowstone and Grand Teton National Park, but they never actually entered that region. There was a period where the group split into two groups, and one group explored the Yellowstone River, the upper Yellowstone River, but they never went as far as to explore the headwaters of the Yellowstone, which would have taken them to Yellowstone Lake and the Yellowstone Plateau. But they heard stories about Yellowstone and the unusual geysers and hydrothermal features of the region. And one of the members of the Corps of Discovery, John Coulter, when left the expedition, he explored what is now Grand Teton National Park and Yellowstone National Park in the winter of 1807 and 1808. And he's the first known person of European descent to enter this region. And he came back with stories and of the geysers and hot springs and the thermal features, and that gave rise to the nickname for this area called Coulter's Hell. Jim Bridger, another trapper. So a lot of these mountain men types were engaged in the fur trade. They were looking for beaver pelts, a lot of money to be made. Beaver pelts shipped back east to be eventually turned into beaver felt hats, which were all the rage in the East Coast and back in Europe. So, Jim Bridger was a trapper, a guide, and explorer, and he was one of the first white men to see geysers. He's credited with, quote unquote, discovering the Great Salt Lake, and he was a contemporary of John Sutter, who eventually ended up in California in Sutter's Mill, the Gold Rush, Kit Carson, George Armstrong Custer, and Hugh Glass, who you may know about from who's the character played by Leonardo DiCaprio in the movie The Revenant, which tells the story of how Hugh Glass survived a mauling from a bear and unbelievably harsh conditions. These guys were very, very, very tough individuals. So let's talk about some of the early scientific exploration of what is now Yellowstone National Park and some of the individuals who were engaged in this exploration. So the first major effort to explore this region and survey this region and to describe this region was in 1870 when an expedition that came to be named after three leaders of the expedition, the Washburn-Langford-Doane expedition, explored the Yellowstone region. So this picture here is a picture of Gustavus Doane, Gustavus Cheney Doane. He was a soldier. He was assigned to Fort Ellis in Montana, and he wanted to make a name for himself as an explorer. But in 1870, he had made a name for himself as being one of the members, if not the leader, a member of an expedition, a detachment of soldiers that participated in a major massacre of pagan Blackfoot Indians along the Marias River in northern Montana, where by some estimates around 200 pagans were massacred by these soldiers, and the evidence suggests that the vast majority, or the majority of these Native Americans who were massacred, were women and children. So this massacre sparked outrage back east and led to major changes in the way the U.S. government interacted with Native peoples. But Gustavus Cheney Doane was a member of this detachment, and at least nominally, this massacre was a reprisal for the murder of a rancher named Malcolm Clark the year before. And so Doane wanted to be an explorer. He took part in this expedition, and one of his talents was writing, keeping a journal, a diary with very vivid descriptions of what he saw in Yellowstone. And when these descriptions made it back east, they were very persuasive in convincing members of Congress eventually, a couple years later, to designate Yellowstone National Park as the first ever national park in the United States and in the world. But in the wake of the Washburn expedition to Yellowstone, there was another expedition in 1871. Doane took part in this expedition as well. He was part of the military escort for this expedition. But this expedition was really led by a geologist, Ferdinand Hayden. And this is a picture of Hayden here. And but this and so one of the things that's really interesting about Hayden is during this expedition, Hayden ascended what is now called Mount Washburn, named after the Washburn from the previous year's expedition. And I showed you a picture of this in an earlier presentation of the view that he saw from the top of Mount Washburn. And immediately he recognized that what he was looking at was the caldera of an enormous volcano. And he wrote about it. So Hayden was a significant, was very significant. His presence in Yellowstone was very significant for describing the geological significance, the uniqueness of Yellowstone National Park. But this expedition included two other individuals, which were incredibly important as well for the eventual establishment of Yellowstone National Park. These individuals were a painter, Thomas Moran, and his paintings made it back east and proved to be very persuasive. I'll show you some on the following slides. And a photographer, William Henry Jackson. So paintings and photographs of Yellowstone made it back east, and Doane's prose may have been very persuasive and descriptive, but nothing matches the visual when it comes to persuasion. So when the members of Congress saw these photographs and saw these paintings, they proved tremendously important in swaying Congress to vote Yellowstone as a national park. So here are some of the photographs of William Henry Jackson that made it back east. So again, remember, this is 1871. and the photographic equipment was primitive by today's standards and bulky by today's standards. But here we have, and of course it's black and white, but it's real. So the combination of these photographs with the color paintings of Thomas Moran were they were synergistic. They were good pairings with one another. So here is this is a picture of Mammoth Hot Springs. And so you see the travertine terraces of Mammoth Hot Springs, and here's some more travertine and sinter deposits. Here's a photograph of the Grand Canyon of the Yellowstone. And here is a photograph of, I'm not sure if it's the upper or lower falls of the Yellowstone, but it's one of the falls of the Yellowstone River in the Yellowstone, Grand Canyon of the Yellowstone. Here are some of the famous, beautiful paintings of Thomas Moran produced during and following his trip to Yellowstone in 1871. Here's a painting of the Grand Canyon of the Yellowstone, showing what I believe is the lower falls. Here's a painting of one of the geysers in the Upper Geyser Basin. That, to me, it looks like Castle Geyser. You got these large deposits of sinter that have built up over the years, and but that's the same geyser basin where Old Faithful is located. And here is a painting of Tower Fall, which is near Roosevelt Lodge, and so we will along the Yellowstone River. So again, these paintings of Thomas Moran in combination with the photographs of William Henry Jackson proved to be tremendously persuasive back east in convincing Congress to designate Yellowstone National Park as Yellowstone as the country's first and the world's first national park. So I want to end this lesson with the story of Chief Joseph and the Nez Perce War of 1877. And again, Gustavus Cheney Doane took part in this war. And it's called a war, but what it really was Chief Joseph, a chief of the Nez Perce Indian tribe. At this time, the Nez Perce had been relocated to a reservation in what is now west central Idaho. And Chief Joseph wanted to lead an exodus from the reservation, and his ultimate goal was to lead his people, which were a large number of them women and children, to Canada and meet up with Sitting Bull in his camp just north of the U.S.-Canadian border. They didn't want to live on the reservation. They wanted something that was more free. So Chief Joseph, with his people, embarked on this exodus, which consistently eluding the U.S. military, and they took a path which ultimately took them through Yellowstone National Park. In 1877, it was already a national park, and up through Montana, and they were ultimately captured here in northern Montana, a short distance from the border. They never made it. But when Chief Joseph was captured and defeated, he had these words, so I wrote them down here. His words were, "Tell General Howard I know his heart. What he told me before, I have it in my heart. I am tired of fighting. Our chiefs are killed. Looking Glass is dead. Two-Haw-Haw Soot is dead. The old men are all dead. It is the young men who say yes or no. He who led on the young men is dead. It is cold and we have no blankets. The little children are freezing to death. My people, some of them, have run away to the hills and have no blankets, no food. No one knows where they are, perhaps freezing to death. I want to have time to look for my children, to see how many I can find. Maybe I shall find them among the dead. Hear me, my chiefs. I am tired. My heart is sick and sad. From where the sun now stands, I will fight no more forever. So, intertwined in this history of Yellowstone National Park, which reaches back to the late Pleistocene, we have a history of conflict. And the 1877 Nez Perce War is sort of an epilogue to this conflict between European settlers pushing east and the native peoples that peopled this land before the Europeans arrived. So I'll leave you with Chief Joseph's words, and that's it for this lesson.